Emma Ralston laughed exactly once the year her mother died, and it was at a funeral, which told you everything you needed to know about the kind of woman she was becoming. That had been 3 years ago, in the spring of 1878, out on the open plains of southwestern Kansas, where the dust never quite settled and the wind never quite quit. Emma was 23 now, and she had built herself into something hard and self-sufficient, the way pioneer women tended to do when life gave them no other reasonable option. She ran her father's dry goods store on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, a town that sat right on the edge of the Kisham Trail, where cattle drives came through like thunderstorms, loud and wild and gone just as quickly. Her father, Harold Ralston, was a good man who loved his daughter deeply but understood her about as well as he understood the Latin he'd half-learned in a schoolhouse 30 years ago. He knew Emma was smart. He knew Emma was beautiful in a way that stopped men mid-sentence when she walked into a room. He knew she had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw, and her mother's complete inability to suffer nonsense from anyone. What Harold did not fully understand was that Emma had decided, with the absolute certainty of a woman who had watched her mother work herself into the grave beside a man who never once made her truly smile, that she would not marry unless the man standing across from her could make her laugh. Not a polite laugh, not a courtesy chuckle, a real, genuine, unexpected laugh that came from somewhere deep and surprised her. She had told this to her best friend, Ruth Calloway, one afternoon while the two of them were mending shirts behind the store counter. "You cannot be serious," Ruth had said, threading her needle with the precision of a woman who had been mending things since she was old enough to hold fabric together. "Perfectly serious," Emma had replied without looking up from her work. "Emma Ralston, every decent unmarried man in Sumner County has come calling at one point or another. Tom Briggs brought you flowers for 6 months straight. Tom Briggs had 3 jokes, and I heard all 3 of them the first Sunday he sat on our porch." Ruth had stared at her for a long moment, and that was reason enough to send him away. That, and the fact that he repeated all 3 jokes the second Sunday, apparently believing I had forgotten them. Ruth had laughed then, which was precisely the problem with trying to explain the situation to anyone. People laughed at the idea of Emma's standard, but no one had actually met it. The summer of 1881 arrived in Caldwell the way it always did, loud and dusty and smelling of cattle and leather and horses that had been ridden hard across too many miles of open plain. The cattle drives were slowing down by then, the railroads having stretched their iron fingers further west and south, changing the shape of commerce and travel in ways that people were still adjusting to. But Caldwell still sat on a significant route, and the town still saw its share of cowboys, trail bosses, gamblers, merchants, and drifters moving through in the course of any given week. It was on a Tuesday morning in late June that Perry Watkins rode into Caldwell with a broken saddle strap, a sunburned nose, and absolutely no idea that the next chapter of his life was waiting for him behind the counter of Ralston's dry goods. Perry was 26 years old, and he had been working cattle drives since he was 19, starting out as a wrangler handling the horses, working his way up to a point rider position, and eventually becoming one of the more reliable hands that the Kincaid outfit out of Texas would hire for the long push north to the Kansas railheads. He was built the way that kind of work built men, lean and strong through the shoulders with hands that were permanently rough from rope and leather. He had dark brown hair that he kept pushed back under a well-worn hat, and his eyes were the particular shade of gray-green that changed depending on what the sky was doing overhead. His face had the kind of easy quality to it that made people want to trust him, which he had found useful in life. More than any of that, Perry Watkins had been blessed or cursed, depending on the moment, with an absolutely uncontrollable sense of humor. It was not the crude, rough variety that passed for comedy around a campfire among a crew of trail hands who had not spoken to a woman in 6 weeks. It was something sharper and more genuine than that, an ability to see the absurd in any situation and to articulate it in a way that caught people off guard. It had gotten him into trouble more than once. It had also gotten him out of trouble more than once. It was simply part of him. The way his gray-green eyes were part of him, something he hadn't chosen and couldn't quite put down. He tied his horse outside Ralston's dry goods because the sign in the window said they carried harness supplies, and he needed a new strap before he could ride another mile without his saddle becoming a genuine hazard. He pushed through the door and heard the small bell above it ring, and the smell of the place hit him first, which was the warm, woody smell of dry goods stores everywhere, fabric and flour and leather, and something faintly sweet he couldn't identify. Emma was at the back of the store, standing on a short step stool and reorganizing a shelf of preserved goods with the focused intensity she brought to every task she undertook. She was wearing a pale blue dress with the sleeves rolled up past her elbows because the morning was already warm, and her dark hair was pinned up but escaping in small pieces around her face in the way it always did when she worked. She heard the bell and called out without turning around, "Be with you in just a moment." "No rush," Perry said, looking around the store. He had been in 100 dry goods stores across Texas and Kansas, and they all had a similar quality to them, a kind of organized abundance, everything the frontier required compressed into one rectangular room. His eyes moved across the shelves and he walked slowly toward the back. Emma stepped down from the stool and turned around, and for a moment neither of them spoke. It was not the dramatic kind of silence that poets write about, where the earth stops turning and the birds cease singing. It was a simpler and more honest kind of silence, the kind where two people look at each other and something quietly registers, like a key sliding into a lock it wasn't expecting to fit. "What can I help you with?" Emma said because she was a practical woman and the store had a living to make. Perry held up the broken saddle strap. "I need something to replace this. Heavy leather, good thickness. My saddle's been threatening to divorce me since about 10 miles back, and I'd like to settle the dispute before it causes a real scene." Emma blinked once and the corner of her mouth moved, just slightly. It wasn't a laugh, but it was something. "I have what you need," she said, moving past him toward the section of the store where he'd seen harness supplies hanging from wooden pegs. She was efficient in her movements, someone who knew exactly where everything was and how to get to it without unnecessary steps. She pulled down 2 options and laid them on the counter. "This one will hold longer, better cut of the hide. It's a penny more, but worth it." Perry examined both and nodded. "The better one, then. My saddle has been through enough." "Have you come up from Texas with the Kincaid drive?" Emma asked, not because she was particularly interested, but because making conversation was part of running a store, and the Kincaid outfit had been coming through Caldwell at this time of year for as long as she could remember. "I have," Perry said. "We pushed 600 head north from Red River Station. Took about 11 weeks. The cattle were disagreeable the whole way, which honestly I understood because I was also fairly disagreeable for most of those 11 weeks." Emma was writing out his receipt. She didn't look up, but she said, "Why were you disagreeable?" "Philosophical differences with the trail cook," Perry said. "He made a coffee so strong it could have been used as axle grease, and when I pointed this out politely, he took it personally. We reached an armistice somewhere around the Canadian River, but things were never fully warm between us after that." Emma stopped writing. She looked up. And then quietly and genuinely she laughed. It was a small laugh, surprised out of her rather than given willingly, a short sound that she pressed her lips together to stop almost immediately, but it was real. It was absolutely real. Perry saw it, and something in him went very still and then very alert, the way a good horse reacts when the wind changes and brings something new with it. "That'll be 42 cents for the strap," Emma said, her voice slightly more composed than she probably meant it to be. Perry counted out the coins from the leather pouch at his belt and set them on the counter. "Thank you, Miss Ralston," she said. "Emma Ralston." "Perry Watkins," he said. He picked up his saddle strap and touched the brim of his hat. "Much obliged, Miss Ralston." He was almost to the door when her father came in from the back room carrying a crate of flour sacks. Harold Ralston was a stout, good-natured man of 55 with a white mustache and the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades outdoors before coming inside to run a store. He looked at the cowboy heading for the door, then at his daughter and back at the cowboy. "Trail hand?" Harold asked Perry. "Yes, sir, Kincaid outfit." "How long are you in Caldwell?" "Few days at least. Trail boss wants to rest the herd before the final push to the railhead." Harold set his crate down and extended a hand. "Harold Ralston, you eat yet this morning?" Perry shook the offered hand. "Cup of coffee and not much else. Martha Jennings runs a good dining room 2 doors down. You tell her Harold sent you, she'll feed you right." Harold glanced at Emma again in the way fathers do when they are thinking something they have decided not to say directly. Perry thanked him and left, and the bell above the door rang again on his way out. Emma went back to her shelf reorganization without comment. Harold watched his daughter for a moment. "Nice young man," he said. "He needed a saddle strap," Emma replied. "He made you laugh," Harold said, and then carried his flour sacks to the back room before she could respond. Emma stood there on her step stool with a jar of preserved peaches in her hand and stared at the shelf in front of her for a good 30 seconds before she put the jar where it belonged and moved on to the next one. Perry spent the first afternoon in Caldwell doing what trail hands did when they arrived in a town after weeks on the trail. He got a proper bath at the barber shop. He had his shirts washed. He ate an enormous meal at Martha Jennings' dining room that included 4 biscuits and something he could not fully identify but ate anyway because it was hot and did not taste of trail dust. He sat in on a card game at the Long Branch Saloon for an hour, won a modest sum without trying to be clever about it, and spent the evening sitting outside the hotel on a bench watching the town settle into its evening rhythms. Caldwell in 1881 was a town in the particular state of becoming. The cattle trade was still alive, but the range was changing, barbed wire going up across the open land in ways that would eventually close the long drives down entirely. The town had a newspaper, 3 churches, 2 schools, a growing residential section, and all the usual frontier institutions of saloons and gambling halls that coexisted with the churches in the uneasy truce that characterized most Western towns. Perry had seen a dozen towns like it, and he liked them the way he liked things that were honest about what they were. He thought about Emma Ralston more than he had any reasonable expectation of thinking about a woman he had spoken to for 4 minutes. What he kept returning to was not her face, though her face was certainly memorable. It was the sound of that laugh. Small as it was, it had been completely genuine, called out of her before she'd quite had the chance to decide whether to give it. And then the way she'd pressed it back, like she was rationing something precious. He had a strong instinct that Emma Ralston did not laugh easily, and an equally strong instinct that making her do, it was one of the more worthwhile things a person could attempt. He went back to Ralston's the next morning with the intention of being transparent about this. Emma was behind the counter when he came in, writing in the store ledger with the serious concentration of a woman who kept meticulous accounts. She looked up when the bell rang, recognized him, and looked back down at her ledger with the deliberate calm of someone who had decided on a posture. "Mr. Watkins," she said, "did the strap not suit you?" "The strap is perfect," Perry said. He stood at the counter. "I came back because I wanted to ask you something, and I thought it was better to do it directly rather than find a complicated way around it." Emma set her pen down and looked at him with the exact expression of a woman who has heard a lot of complicated things from men and is waiting to hear what category this one falls into. "There's a social at the Methodist Church Friday evening," Perry said. "I know I'm only passing through and I know that's not a good recommendation, but I'd like to come and talk to you more if you'd be willing." Emma studied him for a moment. "You're going to be gone in a few days." "The herd moves out Monday," he said honestly, "but I'm back through this way twice a year, sometimes 3 times, and Caldwell is likely to be on my route for the foreseeable future." "A Friday evening social," Emma said. She seemed to be considering the arithmetic of this, tallying up figures that had nothing to do with the store ledger. "I'm told there's dancing," Perry said. "I should be upfront with you that I dance the way a three-legged mule navigates a rocky creek bed. If that's a deciding factor, you deserve to know in advance." The corner of her mouth moved again. This time she caught it before it escaped into anything definitive, but it moved. "Friday evening," she said. "The social starts at 7. My father and I generally arrive at 1:15. Perry touched his hat. "I'll be there." He was there at 7, freshly pressed shirt and his boots actually cleaned, which had taken him the better part of an hour because the trail had put serious work into making those boots dirty. The Methodist church hall was lit with lanterns and strung with fabric bunting, and someone had brought a fiddle player who was worth every cent they were paying him. About 40 people from the town were scattered across the hall in various configurations of conversation, dancing, and refreshment consumption. Emma arrived at 7:15 with her father and Ruth Calloway, who spotted Perry immediately and gave Emma a look that Emma refused to acknowledge. Perry crossed the room toward them without hesitation, which Emma noticed. Men who were uncertain of their welcome tended to hover at a distance and hope to be invited forward. Perry walked directly over, which suggested a comfortable relationship with the idea that he might be turned away. It was a quality she found herself approving of without quite meaning to. "Miss Ralston," he said, and then to Harold, "Mr. Ralston," and then to Ruth, "I don't believe we've met. Perry Watkins." "Ruth Calloway," Ruth said with the barely contained delight of a woman who had been telling her best friend for 3 years that her standards were going to leave her alone and 80. They talked, all of them together at first, Harold asking Perry about the drive, Ruth asking about Texas with genuine curiosity, Perry answering with the easy candor of someone who was comfortable talking to people he'd just met. But gradually, the way these things do, the conversation shuffled itself, and Harold was speaking to the minister, and Ruth was talking to someone across the room, and Perry and Emma were standing near the refreshment table with cups of lemonade that neither of them was particularly focused on drinking. "How long have you been working the drives?" Emma asked. 7 years, Perry said. "Started when I was 19. My father had a ranch in central Texas, small operation, and I grew up with cattle. When I was old enough, I wanted to see more of the country, so I hired on with the first outfit that would take me. Do you miss home?" Perry thought about this honestly rather than answering immediately, which Emma found she liked. "I miss certain things. My mother's cooking is not something any trail cook has ever come close to approximating. There's a creek near the home place where I used to fish that I still think about, but I don't miss staying in one place." He paused. "I'm not sure I've found the right place yet." Emma looked at her lemonade. "What would the right place look like?" "I'm not completely certain," Perry said. "I think it's less about a place and more about what makes a place worth staying in." The fiddle player struck up a reel and several couples moved toward the small clear space that served as a dance floor. Perry looked at Emma. "I wasn't joking about the dancing," he said. "It is genuinely not something I do well, but if you'd like evidence of this firsthand, I'm willing to provide it." Emma set down her lemonade. "I'd like evidence firsthand." They danced, and Perry had not exaggerated. He was not incompetent exactly, but he had a genuine inability to commit to the correct foot at the correct moment, which resulted in a sort of enthusiastic approximation of the steps that was more charming than accurate. Emma, who could actually dance, found herself laughing twice in the span of a single reel, both times because Perry had looked down at his feet with an expression of profound betrayal, as though they were doing this deliberately. "They've been against me all evening," he said after the second time, and Emma laughed again, a real laugh, the kind that made Ruth look across the room with satisfaction. When they walked off the floor, Emma was still smiling in a way she had not particularly planned to be smiling. Perry was grinning and not trying to hide it at all. "I should warn you," Emma said, "that laughing 3 times in one evening is something of a record for me in recent years." "That is both flattering and deeply concerning," Perry said. My father says I've become too serious. What do you say? Emma looked at him sideways. I say that serious things have been happening. That's fair, Perry said, and he meant it without making it into a joke, which she noticed. They talked for another 2 hours, moving from the refreshment table to chairs near the window, finding the kind of conversation that opens itself up slowly, topic by topic, each one revealing something that made the next question a natural extension of genuine curiosity. Perry talked about the landscape of Texas with a love for it that surprised her, the way certain Texas sunsets looked like God had knocked over his paint supply. Emma talked about her mother, briefly, and without the careful distance she usually kept that topic behind. Perry listened without trying to fill the silence she left around it. When Harold came to collect his daughter at the end of the evening, he found her standing with the cowboy near the door, still talking, apparently neither of them having noticed that most other people had gone home. It's past 10, Harold said mildly. Perry stepped back. Yes, sir. I apologize for keeping her. She doesn't look like she minds, Harold said. Emma minded her father's observation considerably less than she would have expected. She thought about Perry Watkins that night, lying in her bed in the house behind the store, listening to the sounds of Caldwell settling into its late-night quiet. She thought about the way he laughed at his own jokes only slightly less than he laughed at other things, which meant he found the world genuinely funny rather than performing for an audience. She thought about the way he had listened when she mentioned her mother. She thought about his gray-green eyes in the lantern light of the church hall. She also thought about the fact that he was leaving Monday, and that 2 or 3 times a year was a long way from a life shared in the same place. She was not a foolish woman. She understood the arithmetic, but she also understood that she had laughed 4 times in one evening, which was more than she had laughed in the previous several months combined, and that felt like information worth paying attention to. The next 2 days Perry found reasons to spend time in and around the main street of Caldwell that had nothing specifically to do with the saloon or the hotel. He stopped by the store twice, once for a tin of tobacco that he didn't particularly need but purchased in good conscience, and once with a question about whether Ralston's carried a specific type of boot oil, which it did. Both times he stayed longer than the purchase required, and both times Emma let him, which she considered a significant concession on her part. On Saturday afternoon, he came in just before Emma was closing up for the evening and found her in a genuine crisis of inventory, having discovered that the count on her bolt cloth was wrong and needing to recount the entire section before she could close the ledger properly. "Can I help?" Perry said. Emma looked at him with the expression of someone who has been taught from childhood that accepting help is the first step toward needing it. Then she looked at the pile of bolt cloth. "Can you count?" "Reliably, yes." "Take that side. I'll start over here. Call out the footage on each bolt. I'll write it down." They spent 45 minutes recounting cloth in companionable silence broken by the occasional called-out number, and when they finished, Emma had the correct count, and Perry had a detailed knowledge of every variety of printed cotton and wool flannel that Ralston's carried in stock. "You didn't have to do that," Emma said, closing her ledger. "I know," Perry said. "But it was either this or watch Johnson's hardware store from across the street, and I've already done that twice today and learned everything there is to learn about it." Emma smiled. "Why were you watching Johnson's hardware store?" "I was watching this store," Perry said simply, "but I didn't want to be obvious about it." Emma looked at him for a moment in the quiet of the closed shop, the late afternoon light coming through the windows in long horizontal bars and laying itself across the counter and the floor in a way that made the whole room feel like something preserved in amber. "You are very direct," she said. "I find it saves time," Perry said. "I have until Monday." "You have until Monday," Emma agreed, as though she were merely confirming a fact of calendar rather than acknowledging what sat behind the words. "I'd like to take you for a ride tomorrow afternoon," Perry said, "if you're willing. There's a section of the river east of town I saw when we were coming up from the south, and it struck me as a good place to look at." Emma considered this. "My father would need to know where we were going. I'd tell him directly." "All right," Emma said. "Tomorrow afternoon." Harold gave his permission without making it a production, which Emma appreciated more than she showed. He liked the Watkins boy, that much was plain, and Perry had handled it properly, coming to him man to man and asking politely, which was the right way to do things. The next afternoon they rode east out of town along the river, taking Emma's gray mare and Perry's own horse, a bay with a dependable quality that Emma liked immediately. The afternoon was hot but not oppressive, a wind coming off the plains that kept the air moving, and the river section Perry had spotted was everything he'd suggested it might be. A wide, shallow bend with cottonwood trees planted thickly along the bank, their leaves turning silver in the wind, and the water running clear and low over a flat gravel bed. They tied the horses in the shade and walked down to the water's edge. Emma took off her boots and sat with her feet in the water, which was cold in the way that river water in late June is cold, surprisingly and wonderfully cold, and Perry did the same, sitting a proper distance away on the same flat rock. "Tell me something true about yourself," Emma said. She said it as though it were a natural request, which coming from her it apparently was. Perry thought about it. "I'm afraid of heights," he said. "Not unreasonably so, but genuinely and inconveniently. It's been professionally embarrassing more than once. You work cattle and you're afraid of heights. Cattle are on the ground." "I've made my peace with the ground," Emma smiled. "Something else. I write letters to my mother every week when I'm on the trail, even when there's no way to send them. I keep them and send them all at once when I reach a town. She's received letters that were 2 months in transit." He paused. "She says she can always tell where I was in my mood when I wrote them." Emma was quiet for a moment. "That's lovely," she said. "Your turn," Perry said. "I was not aware this was an exchange. It seems fair." Emma looked at the water moving over the gravel. "I almost left Caldwell 2 years ago. There was a position available in Wichita, managing accounts for a merchant firm. I had the qualifications. I had accepted in my mind before I ever wrote the letter." "Why didn't you go?" "My father's health was poor that winter. He recovered fully, but by the time he did, the position had been filled." She paused. "I told myself I was relieved. I'm still not entirely certain that was true." Perry looked at her profile, the firm jaw and the dark eyes that were watching the water with the concentration she seemed to bring to everything. "Do you want to leave?" "I want to have chosen to stay," Emma said. "There's a difference." He understood that, she could tell. He didn't try to explain it back to her or improve upon it, just nodded once with the quiet recognition of someone who had thought about similar things in different language. They stayed by the river for 2 hours, and in those 2 hours they covered more real ground between two people than most couples managed in a year of Sunday parlor visits. Not all of it was serious. Perry told her about an incident on a cattle drive 3 years previous, involving a stampede triggered by a particularly agitated prairie dog, which had resulted in a chase that took 3 days to fully resolve, and had become the kind of story told around campfires with increasing dramatic embellishment. Emma laughed at this, a genuine delighted laugh that she did not press back, and Perry felt it like a physical warmth. She told him about the time she had argued a traveling salesman into leaving her father's store without making a single sale, using logic so impeccable that the salesman had actually thanked her at the end, which still baffled her slightly. "He thanked you for refusing to buy his goods." He said it was the first honest conversation he'd had in 6 months on the road. Perry looked at her with something that was not quite a smile and was more substantial. "I believe that completely," he said. The sun was getting toward the western horizon when they rode back to Caldwell, and Perry walked Emma to her door in the direct way he did everything, not making a ceremony of it but not being careless about it either. He stood on the porch step and held his hat in his hands and said what he wanted to say. "I'm going to be honest with you, Miss Ralston. Emma, I know I'm leaving tomorrow, and I know that's the worst possible time to say anything that matters. but I think you're the most interesting person I've met in 7 years on the road, and I think about you when you're not in the room, which is new for me." Emma stood in the doorway and looked at him in the evening light. "Those are honest words," she said. "I want to write to you," Perry said, "with your permission, and I'd like to come back, not just because Caldwell is on the route, because you're here." Emma was quiet for a moment. A cattle bird called somewhere down the street and a wagon went by on the road. The evening was warm and still and the first stars were coming up in the east. "You may write," she said, "and you may come back." Perry put his hat back on. "Then I will," he said. "Both." He left Caldwell Monday morning with the Kincaid outfit, 600 head of cattle moving north in a long brown river of hides and horn, and Perry rode his position at point with the easy competence of long practice. But something inside him had been rearranged in the days he'd spent in that town, like furniture moved to better positions in a room, more sensible now that someone with fresh eyes had suggested the change. He wrote Emma the first letter from Abilene, 3 days after leaving Caldwell, and posted it at the general store there before the herd was loaded onto the rail cars, and his work for that particular drive was completed. He was paid, and he had 3 weeks before the next Kincaid drive would push north, and he spent those 3 weeks at a boarding house in Texas, helping his mother with various tasks around the home place, and thinking about Emma Ralston more than was probably reasonable given that he had known her for 4 days. Emma received his letter on a Thursday in late July, delivered with the regular post. She read it at the counter with the disciplined expression of a woman who was not going to let a letter make her face do things she hadn't approved. By the second page her expression had softened considerably, and by the third page she was smiling in a way that Ruth Calloway, entering the store with a list of needed items, saw immediately. "What is that?" Ruth demanded, less interested in her grocery list than she had been 30 seconds ago. "A letter," Emma said, folding it crisply. "From the Cowboy. From Mr. Watkins, yes." "What does it say?" Ruth advanced on the counter. "It says various things about Abilene and the completion of the cattle drive and the general quality of the rail facilities there." Emma put the letter in her apron pocket. "He has a very good turn of phrase." Ruth stared at her. "Emma Ralston, are you blushing?" "The sun is coming in the window at an angle," Emma said. "What do you need today?" She wrote back that same evening, sitting at the small desk in her room where she kept her correspondence, the lamp burning and the night quiet around her. She wrote to him about the store, about a dispute she was having with a supplier over the quality of a recent shipment of dry goods, about a book she had been reading, and at the end of the letter, almost as a postscript, about the river and the cottonwood trees and how the water had been cold. She did not say everything she was thinking, but she said enough that if Perry Watkins was paying attention, which she had the strong impression he was, he would understand what it meant. He was paying attention. The letters went back and forth through the remainder of the summer and into the fall. Perry wrote about the drives, about the landscape, about the things that struck him as funny or strange or worth recording. He wrote about a sunset over the Palo Duro Canyon that he tried for half a page to describe adequately, and then admitted defeat in a way that made Emma laugh aloud sitting alone at her desk. Emma wrote about the store and the town and her thoughts, increasingly candid, on things she read and people she observed and ideas she had been carrying around for some time without anyone to give them to. She found, with a surprise that she didn't quite want to examine directly, that she had been saying things in these letters that she had never said to anyone, including Ruth. Perry came back through Caldwell in September, as he had promised. He was there for 4 days, and those 4 days had a completely different quality to them than the first visit. The easy familiarity of people who have been talking for months overlaid on everything, making every conversation feel like a continuation rather than a beginning. He took her to dinner at Martha Jennings' dining room on Friday evening, the two of them sitting across a table from each other with the lamp between them, and talked for 3 hours over a meal that extended itself naturally, because neither of them was ready to be done with it. He told her about a conversation he'd had with a fellow trail hand about the future of the cattle drives, about how the range was being parceled up by wire and railroad, about how the long drives from Texas would not last another decade in their current form. "What will you do?" Emma asked. She meant it practically, but there was another question inside it that she was aware of. "I've been thinking about that," Perry said. He looked at her directly. "I've been thinking about it a lot. And I think I'd like to have land of my own, a place to run cattle on my own terms, smaller scale, but something that's mine." He paused. "The question is where?" Emma looked at her plate. "Kansas is good land," she said carefully. "I've been noticing that," Perry said. They were quiet for a moment, and the restaurant continued around them with its warm sounds of other conversations and cutlery and the smell of baking from the kitchen. "I'm going to ask you something," Perry said, "and I want you to answer honestly, even if the honest answer is one I don't particularly want to hear." "All right," Emma said. "Do you think about this? About what this might be?" Emma looked up at him. The lamplight was doing something to his gray-green eyes that she would have described in a letter, but was less certain how to say out loud. "Yes," she said. "I think about it." "Good," Perry said. "Because I think about it constantly, and it's been somewhat inconvenient when I'm trying to do other things." Emma laughed, and it was the fullest laugh he had gotten from her yet, coming from somewhere real and unguarded, and Perry sat across from her in the warm restaurant and felt it like the sun after a long, cold stretch of trail. "You're going to be the death of me, Perry Watkins," she said when she had recovered herself. "That's not the outcome I was hoping for," he said, "but I'll take what I can get." He left again at the end of September, back south for another drive, and the letters resumed. Through October and November they wrote each other with a frequency and a depth that both of them would have found embarrassing to admit to and did not need to, because the letters spoke for themselves. Perry's letters to his mother from this period, which she kept carefully in a ribbon-tied bundle, mentioned Emma Ralston in virtually every paragraph, and his mother, a shrewd woman named Clara Watkins who had survived 30 years on a Texas cattle ranch, wrote back to her son with the succinct directness of a woman who did not believe in wasting words. "If she is what you say she is," Clara wrote, "then you should stop writing to me about her and go do something about it." The particular event that moved everything from correspondence to decision happened in December of 1881. Perry had been hired for a shorter drive, moving a smaller herd from a ranch in the Oklahoma Territory up to a buyer in Kansas, and the route took him through the general area of Caldwell in early December, which was not a time of year he had been through before. He wasn't planning to stop exactly, but the drive ended at a ranch south of Caldwell, and he was paid off there. And it was the middle of a cold, gray afternoon, with the wind cutting in from the northwest, in a way that made the 50 miles between him and Caldwell feel like a challenge worth accepting. He arrived in Caldwell on a Thursday evening in December when the sky was the color of iron, and the first real cold of winter had locked the ground solid. The main street had the stripped-down quality of frontier towns in winter, fewer people moving, everyone who was moving quickly, the whole place contracted and purposeful in the way it wasn't in summer's social ease. He went to the store first, because it was where he went, and found it still open, Emma inside with her father who was dealing with a difficult customer, and Emma behind the counter with the composed, politely immovable quality she used on difficult customers, which was the quality of someone who would give an inch when appropriate and not a single fraction of an inch beyond that. Perry came in and the bell rang and Emma looked up and something moved across her face that was not quite the expression she'd been wearing for the difficult customer. It was something warmer and more unguarded, and she recovered it quickly but not quickly enough. The difficult customer was eventually dispatched, Harold Ralston taking him out with the good-natured persistence of a man who has been dealing with people all his working life. Emma stood behind the counter looking at Perry. "You were not expected," she said. "I know," Perry said. "I was in the area and it seemed like poor manners not to stop." The area, Emma repeated. In December. The weather held. She studied him for a moment across the counter with those dark eyes that Perry had come to understand were always thinking more than they revealed, cataloging and sorting, and arriving at conclusions with the efficiency of a well-kept ledger. "My father is having dinner with the minister and his wife this evening," Emma said. "Ruth is coming to keep me company. You're welcome to join us if you have nowhere else to be." "I have nowhere else to be," Perry said. The three of them had dinner at the Ralston house that evening, Ruth and Perry taking an immediate liking to each other in the way that good-natured people often do, and Emma cooking a meal that was better than anything Perry had eaten since he couldn't clearly remember when. Afterward they sat in the parlor with the fire going against the December cold, and Ruth declared herself tired at 9 o'clock with the completely transparent timing of a good friend who understood when she was excess to requirements. "It was a pleasure, Mr. Watkins," Ruth said at the door, buttoning her coat. "Emma, I'll see you in the morning." She gave Emma a look that said approximately everything she was choosing not to say aloud, and then she went out into the cold evening and the door closed behind her. Perry was still sitting in the parlor, the fire burning low, and Emma came back and sat across from him in the chair she'd been in all evening. The house was quiet. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with the steady patience of objects that outlast their occasions. "I want to tell you something," Perry said. Emma folded her hands in her lap. "Go ahead." "I've been thinking about this since September. I've been thinking about it since before September, honestly, but September is when I started being willing to admit to myself what I was thinking." He looked at her steadily, the firelight on one side of his face, the room's shadow on the other. "I want to settle in this part of the country. There's good land available east of Caldwell. I've looked into it. I could have something going by spring. A small operation to start, but real and solid in mine." Emma was very still and very attentive. "I'm not trying to pressure you," Perry said. "I know I've only known you since June. I know I'm gone more than I'm here, at least for now, though that would change. I know I'm a cowboy who makes bad jokes and dances badly and has a professional dispute with a trail cook that will probably never be fully resolved." He stopped. "What I know with certainty, more certain than I've been about most things in my life, is that I want to be where you are. If you'll allow me to work toward that." Emma looked at the fire for a long moment. The clock ticked. Outside, the December wind moved against the window with a sound like something trying to get in from the cold. "My father thinks you are a good man," Emma said. "He told me so in October without me asking him." "I respect your father," Perry said. "Ruth thinks I should have written you a more direct letter in August," Emma said. "She told me so in November." "I liked your letters very much as they were," Perry said. "I laughed reading your letters," Emma said. "The one about the canyon, the one about the horse who decided to sit down in the middle of a river and refused to get up until the trail boss made a formal apology. I laughed reading them." "That is the story I am most proud of from this entire year," Perry said. Emma looked at him. "I don't give people easy access to me," she said. "I never have. It's not something I'm going to change." "I know that," Perry said. "I'm not asking you to change it." "What are you asking?" "I'm asking for the chance to keep trying," Perry said. "To come back, to be the person you give access to." Emma was quiet for a long moment in which Perry sat very still and let her be quiet, which she appreciated. "There is a piece of land," Emma said finally, "about 6 miles east of town on the river. Tom Granger's son has been trying to sell it since Tom passed in the spring. Good water access, decent grass. My father knows Tom's son. He could introduce you." Perry looked at her. There was a smile beginning at the corner of his mouth, but he held it back with care, understanding that this was a serious thing she was saying and that treating it as anything less would be wrong. "Yes," he said. "I'd like that introduction." "I'll ask my father tomorrow," Emma said. They were both quiet for a moment, sitting with what had just been settled between them, which was a great deal more than the words had said directly. The fire popped and resettled, and the wind moved outside, and the clock kept its steady count. "Emma," Perry said. "Yes. I want you to know. This isn't strategy. I'm not buying land near you as a kind of campaign. I genuinely want the land and I genuinely want to be near you, and those two things happen to be compatible, and I think that's worth being clear about." "I know," Emma said. "You're not a complicated man." "I'm also not going to pretend I don't have intentions," Perry said. "That wouldn't be honest." "No," Emma agreed. "And I value honest." He left that evening for the hotel with the world rearranged again. The furniture of his future moved into positions he was beginning to be able to see clearly. He lay awake for a while in the cold hotel room with his hands behind his head, looking at the ceiling and thinking about Emma Ralston in the chair by the fire with the composed certainty of a woman who knew her own mind, and had just, quietly and precisely, let him into it. He bought the land in January. Harold Ralston made the introduction to Tom Granger's son, a straightforward young man named David who was grateful to sell at a fair price and have the thing resolved. The parcel was 120 acres with the river running along the eastern edge, good bottomland grass, and a modest existing structure, a two-room cabin in adequate condition that a man could live in while he built something more substantial. Perry spent the winter months in Texas, working and saving, buying his starting stock of cattle at the end of February from a rancher he had known through the Kincaid outfit, a small but solid herd of 20 head that he arranged to have driven north to his Kansas land in early spring. He built on his herd throughout the spring by purchasing additional stock carefully, always selecting for quality over quantity. He was at the land by mid-March, living in the cabin, building fence, hauling stone for a proper foundation, working from before dawn to after dusk with the specific energy of a man building towards something that matters. He came to town every Saturday without fail, and the pattern of those Saturdays built itself into something real and known. Perry coming into the store in the morning, helping with whatever needed doing if anything needed doing, taking Emma to dinner or walking with her in the evenings, talking in the way they had always talked, which was frankly and with real curiosity about each other and the world. Ruth watched this development with satisfaction. Harold watched it with the quiet pleasure of a man who had been worried about his daughter's isolation for 3 years, and was seeing it resolve in a way better than he'd had reason to hope for. The town of Caldwell watched it with the collective attention of a small community that knows all its members' business, and finds the romantic ones the most interesting. In April, on a Saturday evening, they were walking along the main street in the particular gold-pink light of a Kansas spring evening, when Perry stopped outside the milliner's shop and turned to Emma with something in his expression that was different from his usual ease. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You seem to frequently want to ask me things," Emma said. "This one is more significant than usual." Emma looked at him. Around them the street went on being a street, a horse tied at the post outside the general store, a family going into the hotel, the sound of a piano from somewhere down toward the saloon district. But that all became very peripheral and very quiet. "I have 120 acres and 27 head of cattle and a cabin that is currently more ambitious in its aspirations than its reality," Perry said. "I have a year's steady work ahead of me before anything I'm building out there is what I want it to be. None of that is what I want to say first." He stopped and looked at her with the direct gray-green look that she had come to understand was him at his most serious. "Emma, I love you. I have been working up to saying that plainly for about 6 months, and I want to stop working up to it and just say it." Emma looked at him in the April evening light. Her dark eyes were steady, not surprised. She had known this was coming the way you know spring is coming when February starts to loosen, a certainty that builds so gradually it seems to have always been there. "I love you too," she said. It was the simplest she had ever said anything significant, and it came out completely clear, without qualification or fence. Perry took a breath that was also a very small laugh of relief. "Good," he said. "That's the best possible news." "Were you genuinely uncertain?" Emma said with something that was almost teasing. "With you, I am never 100% certain of anything," Perry said. which I mean as the highest possible compliment." Emma smiled. A real, full smile, not the corner-of-the-mouth variety she led with, but the whole thing, and it was the most beautiful thing Perry had ever seen in 26 years of looking at a world that was not short on beautiful things. He asked Harold Ralston the following Saturday, going to the man directly as he did everything, and Harold sat across from him in the back room of the store and looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "You know what she told me she required in a husband?" Harold said. "I don't," Perry said, though he had a guess. "She told me she would only marry a man who made her laugh." Harold's white mustache moved in a way that suggested he found this both exasperating and endearing. Her actual words were that if a man could not make her genuinely laugh, there was no foundation on which to build anything else. Perry sat with this. "That's a serious standard," he said. "She's a serious woman who has laughed more in the past year than in the 3 years before it," Harold said. "I've heard her laughing in the evenings when she reads your letters. I've heard her laughing at the dinner table when she's telling Ruth something you said." He paused. "She laughed at the church social in a way I haven't heard from her since her mother was alive." Perry was quiet. "Son," Harold said, "you have my blessing with my whole heart." They were married in June, on a Saturday, in the Methodist church where they had danced badly together 1 year before. Ruth Calloway was Emma's attendant, and Perry's friend and fellow trail hand James Sayers stood with him. Clara Watkins came up from Texas on the train for the occasion, a small, sturdy woman with the same gray-green eyes as her son, and she and Emma spent 20 minutes in a corner at the wedding reception talking with the absolute focus of two people who are deciding they like each other, which they were. "He wrote me about you from June of last year," Clara told Emma. "Every letter from June onwards had your name in it somewhere." "What did he say?" Emma asked. Clara considered this. "He said you were the most interesting person he'd met in 7 years on the road." And then the letters got longer and longer, and the descriptions got more specific, and I thought, well, that's not going to come to anything good unless he does something about it. She smiled. "He did something about it." "He did," Emma agreed. "The wedding was the kind of wedding that Caldwell could do well when it tried, the church full of white fabric and wildflowers, the whole community turning out in the way that prairie communities do for the significant events of their members' lives." Perry and Emma stood at the front of the church and said their vows to each other with the directness they brought to everything, not performing the words but meaning them. And when the minister pronounced them, married Perry took Emma's hands in his and looked at her with something in his expression that was not a joke at all. Not a single thing funny about it. Just the pure and complete seriousness of a man who has found exactly what he was looking for after a long road of looking. Then he leaned close to her ear and whispered something, and she burst out laughing in the church in front of everyone, with the full unguarded laugh that Ruth had been waiting a year to hear in public, and the congregation laughed too because the sound of it was entirely contagious. "What did he say?" Ruth demanded afterward, catching Emma's arm in the receiving line. Emma was still smiling. "He told me the cattle were very supportive of the union but had requested that the reception not run too long as they had grass to attend to." Ruth stared at her. "That made you laugh, in church, in front of everyone." "The way he said it," Emma said. "The timing." Ruth looked at Perry across the room where he was shaking Harold's hand and clapping him on the shoulder, and she shook her head. "Emma Ralston," she said, "it took you long enough." Emma looked at her husband across the room. "I knew what I was looking for," she said. "I just had to wait until it walked through the door." They lived that first year in the cabin on the land while Perry built the house, which he did with the same steady competence and good humor he brought to everything. He hired 2 men from town to help with the heavy work, a carpenter named Bill Alderson and a general laborer named Sam, who was the nephew of the minister, and a young man of tremendous physical capability and very few words. The 3 of them worked through the summer and fall, and by November they had a proper house, 4 rooms with a covered porch on the south side, and a good stone fireplace and windows that looked east toward the river. Emma managed the store through that first year, making the daily ride into town and back, which she found she did not mind because the ride itself was pleasant, and it gave her a boundary between the life of the store and the life of the land. She and Perry had a deal, made early and kept faithfully, that the evenings were theirs, no store ledgers after 6 o'clock, no fence planning after 6 o'clock, just the two of them and the particular quality of the days ending that prairie life offered in abundance. Perry's herd grew steadily through 1882 and into 1883. He was a good stockman with the eye for cattle that came from years on the drives, knowing which animals to keep and which to sell, managing his grass with care, expanding at a pace the land could support. He was not going to be a ranching empire. That was never what he was after. He wanted something solid and his, and it was becoming that. Emma was the one who caught the injustice of what was happening to the land around them, and she said so, more than once, with the precise anger of someone who saw clearly what others preferred not to see. The small ranchers and farmers who had built on open-range land were being pushed out as the larger cattle interests fenced off water sources and drove families off land they'd lived on for years. She saw it in the families who came through the store with less money than they'd had the season before, women buying less cloth, men asking if Harold would extend credit for another month. She talked about it to Perry, who had his own views on it. He had seen what was happening to the open range from the inside, the long drives becoming harder and shorter as wire went up and land was claimed. He had no patience for the kind of operator who built power by squeezing smaller men. "What can we do?" she asked him one evening on the porch, the two of them watching the last light go out of the western sky. "Be honest in our own dealings," Perry said. "Help where we can, and don't pretend it isn't happening." It wasn't a grand solution, and Perry knew it. But he meant it, and he acted on it. And when the following spring a neighboring family named Hobson found themselves in danger of losing their water rights to a large operation that was claiming the creek running through their small property, it was Perry who went with the Hobson husband to the county seat and sat through 2 days of hearings and argued, quietly and factually, with the evidence he had gathered about prior usage rights. They won the water rights case. The Hobsons stayed on their land. It was not a story anyone wrote down anywhere, but Emma knew about it and Perry never mentioned it again, which told her a good deal. Their son was born in the spring of 1883, a healthy boy they named Thomas Harold Watkins, the first name for Perry's father and the middle name for Emma's, which was the kind of solution that satisfied both families. Harold Ralston, who had been quietly and desperately hoping for exactly this, arrived at the house 2 hours after the birth with an enormous amount of food that Martha Jennings had helped him prepare, and sat with the baby in his arms for the better part of an afternoon with an expression of complete contentment. The baby had Perry's coloring and Emma's serious expression, which Ruth said was the funniest combination she could imagine, and which proved prophetic in that Tom Watkins grew up to be a boy who thought deeply about things and laughed at exactly the right moments, which was his father's gift and his mother's timing. The cattle operation grew. Perry hired a hand, a young man named Eli Foster who had come up from New Mexico Territory looking for work, and who proved reliable and capable, and who Perry treated fairly and paid fairly, which was not universal practice on the plains. Emma continued at the store through the fall of 1883, and then made the decision, at the beginning of 1884, to turn the day-to-day management of the store over to Harold and a hired clerk, though she kept the books herself because the books were her domain, and she trusted no one else with them. She began, in that time, to involve herself in the affairs of the town in ways she had not before. She organized with several other women to establish a lending library in Caldwell, collecting donated books and housing them in the back room of the Methodist Church Hall, which was used by the school teacher and the community both. She wrote pieces occasionally for the local newspaper on matters of practical import, carefully documented and argued with the precision that she brought to her store ledgers. The editor, a taciturn man named Harrison who mistrusted opinion and valued clear thinking, published her pieces without editing, which was the highest compliment of his professional repertoire. Perry read everything she wrote with genuine admiration and told her so. "You should have been a lawyer," he told her once. "They didn't take women in 1873 when I would have needed to start," Emma said. "That's a significant failure on the part of the legal profession," Perry said. "I have noted it as such," Emma said, and they left it there. In the summer of 1884, Ruth Calloway married a surveyor named George Atkins who had come to Caldwell on a government mapping contract and stayed permanently. Perry was the one who had introduced them, somewhat accidentally, when George had stopped at the land to ask about landmarks, and Perry had been in town at the store with Ruth visiting Emma, and he had thought, watching George talk to Ruth with the focused attention of a man who suddenly forgets he came in with a different purpose, that this was worth encouraging. Emma was Ruth's attendant at the wedding in August, and there was a quality to the day that was both celebration of Ruth's happiness and also a kind of bookending. Two women who had been each other's primary company through the early hard years of prairie life, now both in lives that were full in a different way. Harold Ralston's health, which had given that scare in the winter of 1879 and been fine since, began to show its age in 1885. He was 60 now, and the store was a demanding thing, and Perry and Emma had the conversation over several evenings about what the right answer was. In the end, Harold agreed, with more relief than he had expected, to sell the store to a young couple named the Porters, who had arrived in Caldwell with retail experience and genuine enthusiasm. Harold moved into a room in Perry and Emma's house that they had built as a separate addition expressly for this possibility, and he spent his days visiting with Tom, who adored his grandfather, and helping with light tasks on the land and reading in the evenings on the porch. He was happy. He was more purely happy than Emma had seen him since before her mother died, and this was something she thought about on the evenings she sat with him on the porch, the two of them watching Tom chase the dog around the yard in the long summer light. "Your mother would have liked him," Harold said one evening, meaning Perry. "I know," Emma said. "She would have been very difficult about it for about a month, and then she would have liked him enormously." Emma smiled. "That is exactly right." Harold was quiet for a moment. "You're happy," he said, "not a question." "I am," Emma said, "genuinely." "Good," Harold said. "That's all she ever wanted for you, you know. That's all she talked about the last year, that she hoped you would find something real." Emma looked at her father in the evening light, this good man who had carried his grief with such steady dignity and given her such steady support, and felt the fullness of the life she was in, the weight and the warmth of it. Their daughter was born in the fall of 1885, a girl they named Clara, after Perry's mother, who came up from Texas again on the train and was there for the birth, proving herself the kind of practical and forthright woman who was exactly who you wanted in the room when a baby was arriving. Clara Watkins Sr. and Harold Ralston sat on the porch the day after the birth in the cool October air and talked for 3 hours, two people who had raised children who found each other, discovering they had more in common than either had expected. Perry held the baby with the practiced ease of a man who had been a father for 2 years now and found it one of the more interesting occupations he'd undertaken. He held her up and looked at her seriously. "She has your eyes," he told Emma. "She has your nose," Emma said from the bed. "A good nose for cattle," Perry said. "This will be useful." Emma reached over and took the baby from him and held her against her chest and looked down at her with an expression that Perry quietly committed to memory. A long, still, complete expression of love so unguarded it was almost private to look at. "Clara," Emma said softly. "Hello." Tom was at the foot of the bed, serious and 2.5 years old, examining his new sister with the profound skepticism of a very young person confronted with something new and confusing. Perry picked him up and settled him on his lap. "That's your sister," Perry told him. Tom looked at the baby. "Small," he said. She'll get bigger, Perry said. Tom considered this with his mother's precision. Okay, he said finally, which was as close to enthusiastic as he was going to get at this stage of the relationship. The land by 1886 was something Perry could stand on and see clearly as what it had set out to be. 60 head of well-bred cattle, solid fencing, the house proper and comfortable, a garden that Emma had made productive with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. Eli Foster had a small cabin on the property now and was as permanent a fixture of the operation as anyone. Perry had stopped going on drives entirely, having done his last one in the spring of 1882, and there was not a single part of him that missed the trail. He had found what the trail had been leading toward. On a Saturday morning in the early summer of 1886, Perry was in town at the general store picking up a supply order when he ran into James Sayers, his old trail hand friend who had been his groomsman, now working for a ranching operation in the Oklahoma Territory, and passing through Caldwell on his way north. They had coffee at Martha Jennings' dining room, which was still running and still good, and caught up in the abbreviated but genuine way of men who were friends without being able to see each other often. "You look well," James said. "Settled." "I am settled," Perry said. "Happy." "Extremely," Perry said without hesitation. James looked at him over his coffee cup. "You know, when you first told me about that woman in the dry goods store, I thought you were pulling my leg." "You were skeptical," Perry agreed. "I was. You'd never stopped anywhere for longer than a week your whole adult life." "I'd never had a reason," Perry said. James was quiet for a moment. "She knows how lucky she got, right?" Perry put his cup down. "I'm the lucky one," he said. "That woman is the most remarkable person I know." "You always were good at knowing what you had," James said. "It's a trait more men should work on." Perry rode home that afternoon through the summer Kansas landscape, the grass high and green, the sky doing one of its particular summer performances of cloud and light that made the plains dramatic in a way that people who had never seen them tended not to believe. He came over the low rise and saw the house and the land spread out before him, the cattle in the lower pasture, Tom in the yard with Harold chasing something that appeared to be a escaped chicken, Clara's washing on the line, and Emma in the garden with a practical hat on her head and her sleeves rolled up. He rode down, tied his horse, and walked to the garden fence. Emma looked up from what she was doing. "Did you get everything from the order?" "Mostly. They were short on the nails. Johnson's sending them out next week." "Inconvenient," Emma said. "It is," Perry said. He was leaning on the fence post looking at her with the expression she had come to know meant he was thinking something he was deciding how to say. "What?" she said. "Nothing," Perry said. "I'm just looking at you." Emma put her hands on her hips. "Perry Watkins." "Emma Watkins," he said with the smile that had never, in 5 years of knowing him, gotten old. "I ran into James Sayers in town. How is he?" "Well, he asked if you knew how lucky you got." Emma pulled a weed from around a tomato plant with the careful attention of someone who wants to get the root. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the luck ran the other way." Emma stood up and looked at him over the fence. Her dark eyes were the same as the first day he'd walked into the store, steady and precise and thinking more than they showed. But there was something behind them now that had been there for years, a warmth that was specifically and only for him, that he never took for granted and never stopped being grateful for. "You're a good man, Perry Watkins," she said. "I try," he said. "And you're still the only man who has ever made me laugh on a sustained basis," she said, "which I consider a significant and ongoing accomplishment." "I consider it my primary professional achievement," Perry said. "Everything else is secondary." Emma unlatched the garden gate and came through it and stood in front of him, tipping her head up slightly because he was a few inches taller, a thing that had never changed. She reached up and touched his face with the hand that still had a little garden dirt on it, and he put his hand over hers, and they stood there in the summer afternoon in that unsentimental and completely sincere way they had always had with each other. "Tom let the chickens out," Emma said. "I saw," Perry said. Harold is handling it. Harold is chasing them, Emma said. That's different. He looks like he's enjoying himself. Emma looked over her shoulder at her father, who was indeed pursuing a hen around the yard with more enthusiasm than strategy, while Tom ran interference on the fence line. She laughed, and the sound of it went out into the summer air with the easy fullness of a laugh that had somewhere comfortable to be. Go help him, Emma said. In a moment, Perry said. He was still holding her hand, and she didn't take it back, and they stood there another minute in the afternoon light, while Harold and Tom organized their chicken recovery operation with varying degrees of effectiveness, and the cattle stood peacefully in the lower pasture, and the house on the Kansas land stood solid and real and entirely theirs. The years that came after were not without their difficulties, because years never are. The drought of 1887 was hard on the grass and harder on the cattle, and Perry made the careful calculations of a man who had prepared for difficulty without knowing its shape, reducing his herd strategically, preserving the breeding stock, coming through it diminished but intact. Emma managed their finances through that year with the iron precision of the store ledger keeper she had always been, finding the places where things could be held back and the places where they could not. And when the drought broke in the summer of 1888 and the grass came back, they rebuilt steadily and without panic. Harold Ralston died peacefully in the winter of 1889, in the room that had been built for him, in his sleep, at the age of 64. He had spent his last 4 years as a grandfather, which had suited him better than anything except perhaps being a father, and he had spent his evenings on the porch with Perry and Emma and James and Clara, and the comfortable conversation of people who have built something together and know it. He was buried in the Caldwell Cemetery beside his wife, and Emma stood at the graveside in the February cold and felt the grief cleanly and completely, the way she had learned to feel things, not pressing them back. Perry stood beside her with his arm around her and said nothing, which was exactly right, which was what he always knew. Later that evening, sitting by the fire after the children were asleep, he said, "He was a good man. He loved you very much." "I know," Emma said. "I told him so." "Good." They sat by the fire for a long time that evening, not talking much, just being in the same room, which had come to be one of the most valuable things in Emma Ralston's life. The simple and extraordinary fact of being in the same room as someone who knew you entirely and was entirely glad of it. Tom Watkins turned 7 in the spring of 1890, a serious and bright-eyed boy who was beginning to read everything he could get his hands on, inheriting his mother's thoroughness and his father's curiosity in equal measure. Clara was 4. Her grandfather's name now attached to a child who had his gentle quality along with her mother's precision and her father's uncontrollable amusement at the world. She thought things were funny at exactly the right moments and laughed at full volume, which Perry found deeply validating. Ruth Calloway Atkins came out to the land on a Tuesday afternoon in that summer, which was not her usual day to visit, and brought with her the look of someone carrying good news at a slightly uncomfortable speed. "George has been offered the position of county surveyor," Ruth said, sitting down at Emma's kitchen table with a cup of coffee. "We're going to stay in Caldwell." "You were considering leaving," Emma said. "There was a possibility of a larger position in Wichita," Ruth said. But George turned it down. She smiled with the look of a woman who has been very well loved. He said he wasn't willing to move Emma away from the only friend who kept her from becoming entirely too serious. Emma looked at her. He said that. His exact words were, "Emma needs you and I think Ruth needs Emma, and I'm not in the business of separating things that belong together." Ruth's voice went slightly unsteady on this last part, and she covered it by taking a very firm sip of her coffee. Emma reached across the table and put her hand over Ruth's. "Good," she said simply. "That's the best possible news." Ruth looked at her and then started laughing, and Emma started laughing, and they sat at the kitchen table in the summer afternoon laughing in the way they had been laughing since they were young women, the kind of laughter that is also relief, also gratitude, also the knowledge that some things hold. Perry came in from the yard 10 minutes later and found them still talking, both of them bright-eyed and clearly in the middle of something good, and he poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter and listened with the satisfied expression of a man who had built a life where this kind of afternoon was a regular feature. "Surveyor," he said when Ruth had explained the news. "George is a good man. He'll do the work properly." "He will," Ruth said. "Unlike certain previous surveyors who ran the Hendersons' property line 4 feet into their neighbor's grazing land." "That was truly a remarkable error," Perry said. "It started an argument that lasted 3 years," Emma said. "Some arguments," Perry said, "have very long legs." Ruth stood to go about half an hour later, and at the door she looked at Emma with the look that passed between them for a great deal. "You look very well," Ruth said. "I am very well," Emma said. "Good." Ruth hugged her. "I'll come Thursday as usual." Emma stood in the doorway and watched Ruth ride back toward town in the summer evening, and then she turned and went back into the house where Perry was washing up at the basin, and Tom was explaining something at length to Clara, who was listening with tolerant skepticism. She stood in the middle of her kitchen and looked at all of it, at the evening light through the windows and the children, and the man at the basin who was currently making faces at Tom's explanation that were causing Tom to try to maintain his serious argument while also attempting not to laugh, which was a losing battle. Tom lost the battle. He laughed. Clara laughed. Perry grinned at Emma over their heads with the gray-green eyes and the expression she knew better than anything in the world. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. She went to the stove to finish the supper she'd started, and Perry came and stood beside her, leaning down to say something quietly in her ear, something completely ridiculous that had nothing to do with anything and everything to do with the specific art of making Emma Ralston laugh, which he had been practicing for 9 years and had not yet exhausted. She laughed. She pressed her lips together and tried to go back to the stove and laughed again. "Perry Watkins," she said. "Emma Watkins," he said. "How many is that today?" It was a game they had started somewhere in the middle of the second year, where he kept a loose count of her genuine laughs, not out of competition, but out of the shared understanding that it was the thing he'd always been trying for, the thing that had started the whole business, and that each one still meant what the first one had meant. "4," she said. "Before supper." "I'm having a good day," he said. "You always have a good day," Emma said. Perry thought about this. "That's not entirely true," he said. "But the days that don't start out well tend to end up better than they started, and that's more than most men can say." Emma turned from the stove and looked at him in the kitchen with the supper going, and the children making noise in the next room, and the whole full weight of the life they had built around them. She reached up and touched his face with the same gesture she had used in the garden years before, the unself-conscious gesture of a woman who has never once regretted the access she gave this man to herself. "Give me 5 minutes," Perry said, with the grin she recognized from a June day in a dry goods store in 1881, before everything had started, when that grin was an unknown quantity and life was a different shape entirely. "5 minutes for what?" Emma said. "To make you laugh again," he said. "Before supper's ready. I have a story about Eli and the fence post from this morning that I've been saving." Emma looked at him with the dark eyes that had always been thinking more than they showed, and what they were thinking now was a version of the same thing they had been thinking since the June day he walked through the door, which was that this man, this particular ridiculous and honest and good man, was the best decision she had ever made by the specific method of keeping a standard no one else had met. "5 minutes," she said, "then supper." He told her about Eli and the fence post, and it took 4 minutes, and she laughed twice in the telling, once in the middle and once at the end. And by the time supper was on the table, the children had come in from the other room drawn by the sound of their mother laughing, because it was the best sound in the house, the best sound on the whole 120 acres along the river, and they crowded around the table in the summer evening, all 4 of them, in the house on the Kansas land. And Perry sat at the head of the table and looked at Emma at the other end, and she looked back at him, And between them the table was full, and the evening was warm, and the life they had made was precisely what a life should be. Everything that had been hard was behind them. Everything that was ahead would be met as they had always met things, which was together and honestly, and with more laughter than most people managed. Because Perry Watkins had walked into a dry goods store on a dusty Tuesday in June, and in the first 4 minutes had done what no one else had done in Emma Ralston's careful and exacting life. He had made her laugh. And then, because he was Perry Watkins and he understood a good thing when he found it, he had never stopped.